Hey everyone. Without a doubt, Robin Hood is one of the most frequently represented humans to have ever lived. Ever since the story began in the Middle Ages, the legendary outlaw of the Sherwood Forest and his gang of outlaws have inspired countless poets, writers, film and theatre directors to immortalize their lives and deeds. One can even wonder whether there was a real man behind the story after all, with all the different candidate historians found to have been Robin Hood. Today, let's know about if Robin Hood was a real person. Let's start the video, but before that, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Robin Hood was a nobleman who lived during the reign of King Richard the Lionheart. He accompanied his king to the Holy Lands and fought alongside his sovereign in the Third Crusade. Robin arrived back to England earlier than the king and found that, in his absence, his lands were usurped by the tyrannical Sheriff of Nottingham and his henchman Guy of Gisborne. Unfortunately, Robin had no hope of defeating the sheriff or Gisborne on his own and thus had no choice but to wait for the king's return. In the meantime, he decided to become an outlaw and teamed up with the local outlaws from the Sherwood Forest. Robin and his merry men then became famous for robbing the rich and giving their loots to the poor. In the end, the king returns and reinstates Robin to his earlier position, and the famous outlaw marries his love, the maid Marianne. This story deviates greatly from the earliest versions. For a start, according to the late 14th and 15th century mentions, Robin Hood was not a noble but a yeoman, that is the one who originally referred to a member of the lower nobility or a freeholder who owned and worked their own land. Nor is it certain that the legendary outlaw lived in the Sherwood Forest or during the reign of King Richard the Lionheart. Just judging by his choice of weapon, the long bow, historians have come up with an alternative timeline. As a widespread usage of the long bow began during the reigns of Edward I and his son Edward II, the story of Robin Hood has been pushed away from the late 12th century to the late 13th and early 14th centuries. The most likely candidate to have been the real Robin Hood was a man called Robert Hood of Wakefield. This good fellow lived during the early decades of the 14th century and worked as a forester in Yorkshire. He supported the Lancastrian revolt against King Edward II, which could explain his antagonistic relationship with the Sheriff of Nottingham. He became an outlaw after the Lancastrians were defeated by the king. Edward II later pardoned him and took the skilled archer into the royal service. This story was backed by the overlaps between the story as we know it and the real-life events of the period. A major pillar of this theory is a record of the household of the king, which mentions a man called Robin Hood in Edward II's employ. Nonetheless, nobody can be 100% certain that Robert Hood, the forester, and the Robin Hood employed by the king were the same person. And the reason for this is very simple. Just looking at the name of the famous outlaw Robin Hood, one can make certain conclusions. The figure was called Robert, as Robin is a diminutive, that is a small in size or stature of Robert. He also had some association with the word hood, most likely thanks to his line of work. Being an outlaw, he wore a hood to make it harder for people to recognize him. As quite a lot of people were called Robin, a good number of the outlaws of England, also many of these people undoubtedly wore hoods. This leaves us with a large pool of possible candidates. In the 13th century, there were several mentions of Robin Hood or Robe Hood describing outlaws, which could potentially mean that, in that period, Robin Hood was a popular alias used by bandits. One of the earliest possible candidates is Robert Hood of York. This good man lost his property due to his deaths and became an outlaw afterward. Two later candidates were Robert Devil and Roger Godbid. both of them active during the 1260s, and both figures became outlaws after the defeat of Simon de Montfort. Finally, there's the story of a man called Robert Fitz-Odo, who was a lord of Locksley during the reign of King Richard the Lionheart. If it was this man with whom the legend began, then Robin Hood was truly of noble descent, as his family was a blood relatives of William the Conqueror, with whose half-brother, Bishop Odo, the lineage began. Just like the Robin Hood we know, Robert Odo also lost his lands during the absence of the king. He led a resistance against his enemies from the woodlands and is mentioned in contemporary chronicles to have been causing trouble after 1196. Just like in the story, we know his lands were also reinstated to him when the king returned from the Holy Lands. The story of Robert Odo matches the story we know very closely, the only difference being the location. The Locksley he was ruling over was not situated in the north, but rather in the south of the country in Warwickshire. Other alternative candidates also emerged during the last few hundred years, but none of their stories was quite like the one we know today, and the reason for this is not a complicated one. Even if there was a real historical Robin Hood, his story had long been mixed up with the story of dozens of other outlaws active in the Middle Ages. And just like in the case of King Arthur, chances are we probably never will know with certainty who was the man with whom the story of Robin Hood truly began. Well, that's it for today. I hope you're liking Nerdies Discoveries. If this story sparked your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe. Keep exploring, and may the winds of wisdom always guide your path. See you in the next. Bye.